Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Sweep Union, and in this one there are several developments across the front line in favor of the Russians. In the Sumy regions, the Russians continue their advances in the direction of Yunakivka, and in the eastern section of the front line the Russians advance to the north of Chasiv Yar, to the east of Pokrovsk, and to the southwest of the city. The Russian advances over the past 12 hours that will be covered in this video cover approximately 20 square kilometers. Starting out in the south, the Russians continue their advance within the Oleksiivka, reaching the western outskirts of the town, and fighting continues over the fortified positions to the north of the town and the Ukrainian last stronghold in the western parts of it. The Russians have now connected their forces in Bahatir with the ones in Oleksiivka, with the bridge across the Vovcha River line now under Russian control. The Russians have a solid connection between the northern and southern parts. The Russians have secured the majority of the town of Oleksiivka, and with an additional advance south of Bogdanivka to the north of Oleksiivka, the Russians are closing in on the northern flank of the fortified positions. The Russians are mainly advancing along the road that connects to the Dnipropetrovsk region through the forest lines to the south of Bogdanivka, from which they have made several advances but are slowly consolidating those positions bit by bit. The Ukrainians have a defensive line here to the north of Oleksiivka that covers the northern flank. The Russians are working on gaining control over this defensive position to push through it and flank the fortifications from their weak spot in the northern flank. The Russians are slowly moving along the highway and the northern flank of it to gain control over the towns alongside the Vovcha River line to open up the road that leads to Novomykolaivka. The Russian advance to the south of Bogdanivka takes place along the road that connects from the eastern flank of Oleksiivka up towards the north. The Russians mainly advance along the forest lines here to the east of the road. Once they gain control over the intersection to the north, the Russians moved to gain control over the forest lines here to the northeast of Oleksiivka, connecting with the forces to the north that connected from Bogdanivka, and with additional assaults from the north through Bogdanivka, combined with assaults from the south through Oleksiivka and from the east through Andriivka, the Russians attacked the Ukrainian positions from three separate directions, gaining control over this pocket area here to the north of Oleksiivka, which opens for the roads to the south connected to Oleksiivka, with combined assaults from the Russian forces from the north and the south. They'll gain control over these roads as well, push towards the fortified positions from the road connected to Oleksiivka from the north, and put the Ukrainians in a pincer maneuver. We see that the roads connect here further to the west, all the way to the southern flank of Pokrovsk, does not connect beyond into the Dnipropetrovsk region. Based on this, it is clear that the Russians are here working on gaining control over the area southwest of Bogdanivka, along the border area to the Vovcha River line in the south, gaining control over the road to allow the Russians to move to the southern flank of Pokrovsk and the northern flank of Oleksiivka, Zelenikut, Novokalynove, and Dashne. On the northern flank of Pokrovsk, the Russians managed to expand their zone of control along the border area with the Dnipropetrovsk region. The Russians created an additional road into the region, where they've managed to gain control over the square first area here to the northwest of Pokrovsk. The Russians are now securing both the northern flanks and the southern flanks of Pokrovsk for offensive operations, going to the flank of the town, cutting off its supply lines and gaining fire control over the town for an operational encirclement. Further north to the direction of Novomykolaivka, the Russians expanded zone of control over the southern streets through an assault from the road to the south of the town. The Russians, as seen with this geolocated footage, entered through the southern road connected from Koptjeve. With this, the Russians have three roads into Novomykolaivka, from the east to the southeast and now also the southwest of the town. The benefits from having multiple roads leading into a town is that they can spread out their forces while attacking the town, which limits the effectiveness of defensive maneuvers, such as the use of FPV drones, as they have to cover a larger area, as well as artillery. Mentioning multiple roads, we see here in the direction of Koptjeve, the Russians managed to gain a foothold within the town. The Russians launched a combined assault from the north, where they managed to expand some control along the forest lines here to the southwest of Chasiv Yar. Following this, the Russians launched an assault through the open fields towards Koptjeve from the north, combined with an assault through the town of Shevchenko-Perche, which they recently captured. The Russians are now expanding the zone of control to the final town ahead of the defensive line of the Ukrainians located to the northeast of Pokrovsk, connecting Pokrovsk to Yunakivka. The Russians continue offensive operations to gain control over the towns and settlements in between the highway intersection and the highway connecting Konstantinivka to Pokrovsk, and the one connected from Yunakivka to Pokrovsk. The objective of the Russian forces is to gain wide control over the road connecting the two cities and to gain full control over the road connecting Konstantinivka and Pokrovsk for the operational encirclement of both cities, both Pokrovsk in the west and Konstantinivka in the east. The Russians lack approximately 710 square kilometers for the operational encirclement of both Konstantinivka and Pokrovsk with the marked out areas. If the Russians want a secure operational encirclement of Pokrovsk, they'll need to gain control over parts of this defensive line, or gain control over towns such as Novomykolaivka, and flanking the defensive line and the main supply road north of Pokrovsk from the east. They would also need to expand the zone of control west of Pokrovsk to include towns such as Novomykolaivka, Meshova, and Slovyanka. This would mean a wide flank on the western flank of Pokrovsk and a deeper push towards the eastern flank of the city. This will allow the Russians cut off all supply roads except for the main highway to the north of Pokrovsk, which they would have fire control over with artillery, tanks, long-range weaponries of about 5 kilometers range, and FPV drones. To the north of Chasiv Yar, the Russians managed to advance along the western flank of Yunakivka, along the canal, getting control over the northern bank of the canal here. The Russians are advancing along the canal to gain control over the fortified positions in the area and to secure the southern flank of Oleksiivka for future offensive operations towards the town to gain full control of it. And also, the Russians will be looking to cross over the canal, expand the zone of control north of Chasiv Yar to fight over towns such as Novomykolaivka and Markova to gain control over the northern flank of the operational encirclement of Konstantinivka, which will span from Novomykolaivka and Markova in the north through the railways here to the northeast and northwest of the city. In the northern section of the front line in the Sumy region, the Russians continued offensive operations towards Yunakivka. The Russians here managed to gain control over the highway here south of Yablinivka. Following the capture of the town, they moved towards the highway, gain control over the intersection here to the south of the town. Since then, they've now moved alongside the highway towards the western flank of Yunakivka, gaining control over some of the forest lines and the defensive position here west of the town. The Russians are working on gaining control over the first line to the southwest of Yunakivka to cut off additional roads here to the south of the town, and they're also storming the town directly head on from the northern flank. They already had a foothold following the capture of Luknia, which is now being expanded to the western flank, western bank of the river line as well. And with control over the first lines and first patches, the Russians are expanding the zone of control for a third of the area covering Yunakivka from the northern and western flanks. The Russian offensive operations here in the Sumy region have been centered around expanding the zone of control along the border area. To properly establish themselves across the border area, the Russians need to gain control over Yunakivka as a main supply hub for future offensive operations. The Russians have already been working on clearing off the highway here further west in the direction of Encirclement and so on. The objective would be to cut off the highway intersection there and cut off the towns in between Yunakivka and this intersection from their supply lines, limiting supplies going towards the frontline positions. With control over Yunakivka, the Russians would be able to have a strong flank here from the eastern direction to push towards the Ukrainian positions. The Ukrainian positions here are facing a lot of difficulties establishing themselves because the fortifications were being neglected despite the Russian push into Kharkiv back in May of 2024. The Ukrainian Kursk incursion allowed for officials who were in charge of building fortifications to neglect these fortifications as the Ukrainians were on the Russian side of the border. But now that the Russians managed to end the Kursk incursion of the Ukrainians and reverse the situation, this is coming to light, and the fortifications that weren't properly prepared are putting the Ukrainian forces who are defending this section of the front line in a very difficult position, where they're constantly being forced to withdraw, as they are being heavily shelled by Russian forces, especially FPV drones, as the Ukrainians are attempting to send their vehicles to the front line to establish a defensive line. The Ukrainians managed to establish a defensive line in the second line of defense, as the Russians were advancing at the front line, at the first line of defense, which is why the Russian advances have slowed following the capture of some of these frontline towns. But due to heavy shelling over Yunakivka, since the Russians captured Luknia and the fighting took place over that town, the defenses are now slowly falling apart. And with the capture of Jablonivka, which opened the road to the western flank of Yunakivka, the Ukrainians are now put in a very difficult position, especially with the lack of supplies and reinforcements that are able to be sent to the town. With the highway between Sumy and Yunakivka now under Russian control, leading all the way up to the town, the Russians can also expand offensive operations to the eastern flank of Yunakivka for a 50% covered frontline assault from the western, northern, and eastern directions. The Russians will look to gain full control over the town, establish it as their own supply hub, and launch further offensive operations to gain control over the towns of Khutin to the west, all the way to Satki in the east, and establish themselves within the forest patch areas here to the south. At the same time, the Ukrainians are also lacking in manpower to deal with this Russian incursion, as they're focusing their forces on the Kursk region in the direction of Tetkino and Koevo, here on the flanks of the Russian Sumy incursion. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.